I will never forget the day my parents took my son away from me. I was 17, and I was lying in that cold hospital room, holding his tiny body in my hands. He was so small, wrinkled, with thin fingers clutching my little finger. My eyes were looking at me as if he knew I was his mother. But I couldn't stay that way. My parents had decided for me, and their word was law, and mine was just dust under their feet. They said that I was a disgrace, that I would ruin my life, their life, if I left him. And I believed them. Hell, I was a child alone, scared to death, and I believed. My name is Sarah, and this happened 22 years ago. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone and reputation was more important than air. My parents, strict, God-fearing people, kept me in iron gloves. When I got pregnant, I thought it was the end of the world. The guy who was the father disappeared as soon as he found out, leaving me alone with a growing belly and a mother who looked at me as if I had brought a plague into their home. I remember her standing over me in the kitchen, her lips pressed into a thin line, telling me there was no other way. You can't raise a child, Sarah. You are still a child. We'll make it go away. And it did. As if he was a stain that could be wiped off a shirt. The labor was hell. I was screaming, sweat was pouring out of my eyes, and the nurses were holding my hands, whispering that I was strong. But I didn't feel strong. I felt torn, in body and soul. When he was born, I held him for a few minutes. Those minutes were mine, the only ones when I could call him mine. I gave him a name in my head, Elijah. I didn't have time to say it out loud because the nurse took him away and my mom was standing in the doorway, her eyes as cold as ice. This is the best thing, Sarah, she said as I sobbed, begging for him back. My dad didn't come. He couldn't even look at me. They organized everything quickly. I don't know how they found the people who took him, but 2 days later I came home without my baby. My room was the same as always, posters on the walls, a teddy bear on the bed, but I was different. I lay there, holding a pillow, and felt the emptiness devouring me from the inside. My mom came in, put a bowl of soup on the table, and told me that I had to move on. We saved you, Sarah. You will still have a chance for a normal life. A normal life? I wanted to scream that they had killed me, that they had torn out a piece of my soul and thrown it away. But I was silent. I was always silent in front of them. The days dragged on like years. I went back to school, walked the halls, smiled at my friends, pretended that everything was fine. But every night I would lock myself in my room and cry into my pillow so they wouldn't hear. I would imagine him, where he was, or someone hugging him, or singing him lullabies. I hated myself for not fighting. Why didn't I run away? Why didn't I say no? But I was a scared girl, and they were a mountain I couldn't move. My dad sat down with me at dinner one night and said I should thank them. We gave you a future, he grumbled, not taking his eyes off his plate. I gripped my fork so tightly that my fingers turned white, but I nodded. Because what could I do? They never talked about him again. As if he didn't exist. But I couldn't forget. Every time I saw a pregnant woman or a baby in a stroller, my heart would clench. I felt his absence like a phantom pain in a severed arm. I graduated from high school, left that damn town, went to college in Cleveland, and tried to live. But he was with me in my dreams, in my thoughts, in the shadow that followed me everywhere. I didn't know where he was, who was raising him, if he was happy. And it was killing me. Years passed, and I kept it inside me like a bomb that could explode at any moment. I became a barista, then a coffee shop manager, and built a small life. But every birthday, every New Year's Eve, I thought. How old is he now? Does he look like me? I didn't look for him. I was afraid that I would find out something that would crush me completely. But that day in the hospital never left my mind. And I knew that somewhere in the world there was a boy with my eyes whom I had lost. And I had no idea if I would ever see him again. After I gave Elijah away, life became a gray area that I tried to paint with some color. I left Ohio, leaving behind a house where every corner screamed about my loss. Cleveland became my refuge, a bustling city where I could hide from myself. I was 19 when I started working as a barista in a small coffee shop in the neighborhood. I made coffee, smiled at customers, pretended everything was normal. But every night, when I returned to my tiny apartment, the shadow followed me. He was there in the silence, in the empty cup, in my hands that once held him. My parents would call sometimes to ask how I was doing, but they never mentioned what had happened. For them, it was a closed chapter that they tore out of the book and burned. My mom once said on the phone that I should be grateful for a new beginning. I clutched the phone so tightly that my fingers hurt and grunted something back. Grateful? They took away my child, my flesh and blood, and they thought I should kiss their feet for that. But I didn't argue. I realized a long time ago that it was useless to fight with them. They were like a wall, cold and impenetrable. Dad rarely spoke at all. His silence was heavier than his words, and I felt that he was still ashamed of me. I tried to live. I finished management courses, worked my way up to managing a coffee shop, bought an old car so I didn't have to take buses. I dated guys, but none of them stayed for long. As soon as it got serious, I backed away. Because how could I tell them? Oh, by the way, I had a son, but I gave him away because my parents said I was a disgrace. I would imagine their eyes a mixture of pity and disgust, and I would shut up. My secret had become a cage in which I sat alone, and the key to it had long since been lost. I hated myself for that, for being weak, for not fighting, for letting them decide for me. Sometimes I looked for him. Not openly, not with documents or agencies. I was afraid I would run into a wall that would crush me. But I would look through old newspapers in the library, looking for adoption ads, even though I knew it was stupid. One day I even went to an agency in Columbus, stood in front of the door, holding a piece of paper with their address. But I didn't go in. My heart was pounding, my hands were trembling, and I ran away like a thief. What could I say? Hi, I gave my child away 20 years ago, can you find him? I imagined them looking at me, another broken woman who doesn't know what she wants. And I would return home, to my cage. Life went on. I turned 30, then 35. I bought a small apartment, learned how to cook a decent steak, got a cat named Storm because he liked to chase his own tail like a hurricane. On the outside, I was normal, Sarah, the coffee shop manager, always with a smile and a joke about the weather. But inside, I was drowning. Every time I saw a mother and her son, a teenager or a toddler, I stopped. Looking at them, I imagined him. How old is he now? 20. Is he tall? Does he like coffee like I do? Does he know that somewhere there is someone who thinks about him every day? My parents would come once a year, bring homemade jam and tell me about their neighbors. I would sit across from them at the table, listen to their chatter, and feel the anger boiling inside me. One day I couldn't stand it any longer. Do you ever think about him? I asked, my voice quiet but sharp. Mom froze, the spoon of jam hovering in the air. Dad coughed and looked away. Who? She said, as if she didn't understand. I clenched my fists under the table. About my son, I blurted out. The silence became as heavy as a stone. We did what we had to do, Dad finally grunted, and Mom nodded. I stood up and went to the kitchen, because I knew if I stayed, would blow everything to smithereens. After that, I stopped calling them. They called, wrote, but I answered briefly, coldly. Their excuses strangled me. They thought they had saved me, but I knew the truth. They had saved themselves, their reputation, their little perfect world. And me? I was left with a hole in my soul that nothing could fill. I imagined him, how he was growing up, how he was laughing, how he might hate me for abandoning him. And I couldn't bear it. One evening I sat with a glass of wine, looking at the rain outside the window. The storm was purring in my lap, and I was thinking, did he ever look for me? Did he know that I didn't want him to? I had no answers, but that pain was my constant companion. And I had no idea that in a few weeks everything would change. That he would come into my life without knowing who I was and turn everything upside down. But then I just sat there, holding the wine, and felt the shadow growing inside me. I wasn't looking for him, but he found me. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, when I was standing behind the counter of my coffee shop in Cleveland, pouring a latte for another customer. The door opened, the bell above it jingled, and I looked up. A guy walked in tall, thin, with slightly tousled dark hair. He was carrying a battered backpack, and his jeans were dusty, as if he had just walked halfway across town. I smiled as usual and asked him what he wanted to order. He looked at me, and I froze. His eyes dark brown, deep, with golden dots were mine. Exactly the way I saw myself in the mirror every day. My legs felt cottony, but I grabbed the counter and exhaled. It couldn't be him. It was just a coincidence. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and sat down by the window. I tried to concentrate on my work, wiping the cups, sweeping the floor, but my eyes kept coming back to him. Something in his movements, in the way he looked thoughtfully at the street, squeezed my heart. He was young, about 21 or 22, the same age Elijah would have been. I shook my head, telling myself that this was stupid. How many people in the world have eyes like that? But that prick in my chest wouldn't go away. I could feel it, not with my mind, but with something deeper, an instinct that I had suppressed 22 years ago. It came again. 2 days later, then a week later. He always took the same thing, black coffee, and sat by the window. I started to notice little things. He had my nose, a little snub-nosed, with a slight bump. His fingers nervously clutched the cup, like mine when I was nervous. One day he smiled at me when I accidentally spilled milk, and I saw a dimple on his left cheek, just like mine. Every time he came in, I felt my hands trembling, but I kept it together. He didn't know who I was. To him, I was just Sarah, the coffee shop manager who sometimes got the orders wrong. Then he asked me about my job. His voice was quiet, with a slight hoarseness. He said he was looking for a part-time job, that he had just moved to Cleveland and needed money. I didn't think twice about hiring him. Not because I needed another barista, but because I couldn't let him go. He called himself Jake. Jake Harper. The name stabbed me like a knife, but I smiled and told him he could start tomorrow. When he left, I sat in the back room and cried. I don't know why, from hope, from fear, from the fact that he was so close but so far away. Jake started working, and I started seeing him every day. He was diligent, though a little clumsy. He spilled coffee on the first day, burned a croissant on the second. But the customers loved him for the quiet politeness he had. I watched him from behind the counter, and his every move was like a punch in the chest. He laughed the same way I did, shortly, with a slight exhale. His eyebrows furrowed as he concentrated, just like mine. I started to hate myself for thinking that. What am I doing? Making up a fairy tale because I can't let go of the past. But what if it's not a fairy tale? One evening he stayed to help clean up. We were standing together in an empty coffee shop, wiping down the tables, when he suddenly told me that he grew up in a foster home. My hand froze over the rag. He didn't look at me, just spoke as if it were nothing. He said he was given away right after birth, that he didn't know his real parents. I felt the air being knocked out of my lungs. I wanted to ask him more, where he was born, when, who raised him, but I was silent. Because if I opened my mouth, everything would come out, the truth, the pain, everything I had been hiding for years. He went home, and I stood in the darkness of the coffee shop, looking at his empty cup. My thoughts were buzzing. 22 years ago, I gave birth to a boy in a hospital in Columbus. He was taken away right away, and I didn't know where. Jake was from Ohio, born around the same time. And those eyes were my eyes. I sat down on a chair and covered my face with my hands. Is this him? My Elijah? Or am I going crazy, clinging to a phantom hope? I couldn't breathe at the thought. If it was him, why was he here? Why now? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and imagined how things could have been. If I had fought, if I had run away with him, if I hadn't listened to my parents. But I did, and now he was standing in front of me, a stranger with my face. I knew I had to find out more. But how? How can I dig into his life without destroying everything he knows? And what if he found out who I was and hated me for leaving him? I closed my eyes, but the dream didn't come. He was here, in my world, and I didn't know what to do about it. Jake had become a part of my life, and it was both saving and killing me. Every day I saw him at the coffee shop counter, pouring coffee, joking with customers, furrowing his brow when the espresso machine broke down again. I knew his habits. He always drank water before his shift, liked to listen to music in his headphones while mopping the floor, and hated the smell of cinnamon, though he never said why. But I didn't know the main thing, whether he was mine. Whether the boy with my eyes, whom I held 22 years ago, was standing in front of me, not knowing that I was his mother. And this thought held me hostage. I started digging. I couldn't stop, even though I hated myself for it. One evening when he left, I found his job application in a folder. There wasn't much on it, a name, a date of birth, a dorm address in Cleveland. But the date of birth hit me like a bolt of lightning. April 22nd, exactly 9 months after I got pregnant. I sat in the back room, holding that piece of paper, and felt my heart pounding in my throat. It wasn't proof, but it was too close. I remembered the hospital in Columbus, the night they took him away. Could he have ended up in Ohio? Could his foster parents have given him the name Jake? I began to watch him even more closely. One day he told me how he grew up in a small town an hour from Columbus. He said his foster family was good, but poor. His father worked in a factory, his mother sewed at home. He dropped out of school at 16 because he wanted to earn money, not study. I listened, nodded, but inside I was screaming. His life was hard, not what I imagined for my son. I dreamed that he would grow up in love, with prosperity, with parents who would sing him lullabies. Instead, he struggled, just like I did. And I felt that it was my fault. If I had not given him away, he would not have known this poverty. He didn't know that I saw him as more than just a worker. One day he brought me an old photo and showed me, laughing, how stupid he looked when he was 10 years old. I took that picture, and my hands trembled. He looked like me, not just his eyes, but the curve of his lips, the dimple in his cheek. I pretended to laugh with him, but a storm was raging inside me. I knew it was him. My Elijah. My son. But I couldn't say it. How could I? He was living his life, not knowing that I was standing in front of him, that I was the one who had abandoned him. I began to wonder if I should tell him. Every time he smiled at me or asked for advice, how to save money for rent, how to fix his old bike, I felt the truth bursting out. But what could I say? Hi, I'm your mom, who gave you away because she was a scared, stupid girl. I imagined his eyes, how they would be filled with surprise, then anger, then hatred. He could have hated me, and I wouldn't have blamed him. I hated myself for it every day. One evening we were alone in a coffee shop. He was washing cups, and I was wiping the tables. He suddenly said that sometimes he thinks about his real mom. My hand froze over the rag, but I didn't look up. He said he didn't know why she gave it away, but he hoped she had her reasons. Maybe she just couldn't, he added, his voice quiet, almost sad. I felt tears burning in my throat, but I held them back. Maybe, I grumbled, and he nodded, as if that reassured him. And I was torn. He didn't know that I was standing there, that I wanted to scream, that I had no choice, that I loved him more than myself. That night I came home and opened an old box under the bed. There were things I'd been hiding for years: a bracelet from the hospital, an ultrasound scan, a piece of paper where I'd written Elijah. I held that bracelet and cried like I hadn't cried since that day in the ward. He was here, in my life, but I couldn't hug him. I knew I had to find out for sure. I called a friend who worked in social services and asked her to check, quietly, without names. She said it was difficult, but she would try. I waited, feeling the days drag on like an eternity. A week later, she called me back, her voice tense. She said that there were records of a boy born in Columbus that day, given up for adoption in Ohio. The name had been changed, but the dates matched. I hung up the phone and sat down on the floor. It was him. My son. Jake was Elijah. And now I was standing in front of an abyss. Should I tell him? Destroy his world to make mine easier? Or stay silent, watching him live next to me without knowing? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I couldn't take it much longer. Now that I knew Jake was my Elijah, every day was torture. I walked around the coffee shop, brewing coffee, counting the revenue, but it was all like a dream through which I saw him. He was standing behind the counter, laughing with customers, washing cups, and I felt my heart breaking. He was my son, but I couldn't say it. Every time he called me Sarah, I heard a tenderness in that word that I didn't deserve. And I hated myself for it, for standing so close, but unable to cross the wall I had built 22 years ago. I tried to move on, to pretend that nothing had changed. But the truth was gnawing at me like a rat making its way through my ribs. One evening he stayed after his shift, and we sat at a table with cold coffee. He told me how his foster mom died 2 years ago, how he was left alone because his father drank and didn't care about him. He said he came to Cleveland to start from scratch. I listened, and every word he said was like a blow. He was struggling, he was lonely, and I could have been there for him. If I hadn't given him up, he wouldn't have known this pain. I clutched the cup so tightly that my fingers turned white and grumbled something about him being strong. But inside I was screaming, it was my fault. My parents were the next blow. I hadn't seen them for years, but one day my mom called. She said that my dad was sick, that they wanted to come to me. I didn't want to see them, but I agreed. They came a week later, old, hunched over, with the smell of their old home in their clothes. We sat in my apartment, drinking tea, and I could feel the anger boiling inside me. My mom was talking about the neighbors, and my dad was coughing into his handkerchief, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Do you remember my son?" I asked, my voice sharp as a knife. They froze. Mom put down her cup, her eyes narrowed. "Sarah, we don't talk about this," she said quietly. I stood up, feeling everything inside me explode. "But I am. He was mine, and you took him away." Dad looked up, his face red with coughing or anger. "We saved you, Sarah. You were a child who didn't know what to do. We gave you a chance." I laughed, sharply, bitingly. "A chance? You ruined me. Do you think I've forgotten how you stood in that room and watched me cry?" Mom looked away, her hands trembling. "It was for your own good," she grumbled. I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I held back. "And for his good? Do you know where he's been all these years? Do you know that he grew up without me because you decided for both of us?" They were silent, and I knew they didn't care. Their truth was set in stone, and mine was just a shadow they ignored. After they left, I sat in the dark, holding that bracelet from the hospital. They hadn't changed, just as cold, just as sure that they had done the right thing. But I had changed. I was no longer the scared little girl who listened to them. And now Jake was here, in my life, and I had to decide what to do. Should I tell him? Should I give him the truth that he might not want to know? Or keep it all to myself, watching him live next to me without knowing? He began to open up to me more. One day he told me how his foster father used to beat him when he got drunk. He said he ran away from home when he was 17 and lived with friends until he saved up money to move out. I listened, and every word cut me. He was suffering, and I was here, building my little life without knowing. I wanted to hug him, to tell him that I was here, that I had always been here, but I couldn't. What if he pushed me away? What if he said I had no right to leave him? I began to approach him not as a mother, but as a friend. I invited him to lunch after his shift, helped him repair his bike, and listened to his stories. He called me his man, and I felt like this word was tearing me in half. I was his person, but not in the way he thought. And the closer I got to him, the more I was afraid. Because if I told the truth, it could destroy everything: his trust, his peace, his life. But if I kept quiet, I would destroy myself. One evening he came home with a black eye. He said he had a fight with a neighbor in the dormitory, that he had stolen his money. I gave him some ice, sat down next to him and felt my maternal instinct explode in me. I wanted to protect him, to take him to my place, to give him the home he never had. But I was silent because I knew that one wrong step and I would lose him forever. He looked at me with those eyes, my eyes, and said that I was the only one he trusted. And I realized, I have to choose. Truth or silence. And I didn't know what was worse. Jake had become my world, and I couldn't live with this secret strangling me anymore. Every look he gave me, every laugh, every bruise on his face screamed that I had to do something. I woke up every night in a cold sweat, imagining how he would find out the truth from someone else, from the agency, from the documents, from God, if he decided to punish me completely. I knew I was standing on the edge, and the choice was simple, but at the same time the most frightening of my life. To tell him who I was and risk everything, or to keep quiet and watch him go his own way, not knowing that I was his mother. That night with the black eye turned everything around. I sat across from him in a coffee shop, holding a cold compress, and felt a mother's rage boiling inside me. Someone stole his money, someone hit my son, and I stood by, playing the role of the good boss. I hated myself for that, for not being able to hug him, for not being able to tell him that I was here, that I had always been here, even when I was gone. He thanked me for the ice, smiled with those eyes of mine, and I felt the last thread of patience breaking. I couldn't hide anymore. The next day I made up my mind. I didn't know how to do it, but I knew I couldn't keep silent anymore. I invited him to my house after my shift and told him I wanted to talk about something important. He agreed, joking that I would probably raise his salary. I smiled, but I was trembling inside. When he walked into my apartment, I felt the air getting thick. Storm, my cat, rubbed against his legs, and he laughed as he stroked him. I stood in the kitchen holding 2 cups of coffee and thought, this is my chance. My only chance. We sat down on the couch and I started. I told him that I had wanted to tell him something about myself for a long time. My voice was trembling, but I held on. I told him how I was a scared girl at 17, how my parents forced me to make a choice I didn't want to make. He listened, his eyebrows furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. I pulled out the bracelet from the hospital, small, yellowed, with tiny letters that were barely legible. I put it on the table in front of him and told him that 22 years ago I gave birth to a boy. My son. His name was Elijah, but I didn't know what name he was given later. I stopped, feeling tears choking me, and looked at him. He sat silently, looking at his bracelet. His fingers clutched the cup, but he didn't move. I could see the thoughts spinning in his head, like he was putting together a puzzle. I didn't say, "It's you," directly, but he was no fool. His eyes, my eyes, rose to me, and I saw a storm in them. Surprise, pain, maybe anger. He put the cup on the table and stood up. "You think I..." He began, but stopped. I nodded, unable to speak. He stepped back, his hands shaking. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" His voice was quiet but sharp as a knife. I opened my mouth, but the words were stuck. Because what could I say? That I was afraid. That I was ashamed. That I didn't know how. He walked to the door, and I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. I stood up, begging him to wait, but he was already at the door. "I need to think," he grumbled and disappeared into the darkness. The door slammed, and I fell on the couch, holding that bracelet. I didn't know if he would come back, if he would hate me, or if he would just disappear, like I had once disappeared from his life. But I did it, I revealed the truth, though not all of it. And it was like tearing out a piece of myself and throwing it into the abyss. The days dragged on like an eternity. He didn't come to work, didn't answer his phone. I walked around the coffee shop like a ghost, pouring coffee, smiling at customers, but there was emptiness inside. I imagined him sitting in his dormitory, looking at that bracelet I left it for him and wondering what to do. Did he believe me? Did he understand? Is he cursing me now? I didn't know, but I felt like I had lost him for the second time. A week later, he came back. He came into the coffee shop, thin, with dark circles under his eyes. I was standing behind the counter, and my hands were shaking. He came over, put the bracelet on the table and said he had checked it. His ID, his date of birth, his history, everything matched. He knew. I was expecting anger, screaming, but he just stood there, looking at me. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, and his voice cracked. I stepped forward, stretched out my hand, but stopped. "Me neither," I whispered. He didn't hug me, didn't call me mom, but he didn't leave either. We stood there, between the truth and the silence, and I knew that this was not the end. It was the beginning, painful, awkward, but real. I didn't know if he would ever forgive me, if he would ever want to know me. But I took a step, and he didn't back down. And when I looked at him, I felt something new, not guilt, not shame, but hope. Maybe we will find a way. Or maybe not. But the door was open.